Shut up and sit down.
I'm Brent Simpson, professor of sociology at the University of South Carolina. I teach Introduction to Sociology, I teach courses in social psychology, and sometimes I teach courses in altruism and cooperation. My research interests primarily revolve around altruism, cooperation, collective action, that is what makes people give up their own self-interest for the good of the group, or how do groups pursue collective goals. I'm also interested in issues of how people perceive inequality and the conditions under which people will become worried about the level of inequality that exists. I think that there are a couple of things that I find interesting and maybe that have got a bit more press than most of the research I do. And one of those things is the effects of violence by protest groups on not only for those groups that, say, do or do not use violence, but also groups that they're aligned against. So I was inspired to do some research on violence and protest during Charlottesville. White nationalists had a very large rally there. They were protesting the removal of Confederate flags over at different places in the country. So they staged a protest, and this was August 2017. And a group of anti-racists staged a counter-protest. You know, in Charlottesville, there was the question of how do you best confront white nationalists, and this was occurring at a number of other places in the country. And a number of those places, varied in the extent to which people or the anti-racist aligned against the white nationalists were acting violently or not. And while we can maybe understand the temptation to act violently towards groups that you vehemently oppose, there is also the question of, is this strategic? These groups are actually aiming to do something, and they want to win public support and ideally turn off public support, or what little public support might already exist for white nationalists. So the difficulty in sort of knowing, we can't just look out to the real world and say, okay, violence does or does not help these protest groups, because the real world is very messy, and groups that use violence are fundamentally different, or facing different circumstances than groups that do not use violence. So what we did is we built on the newspaper reports that were being published about these confrontations between white nationalists and anti-racists. To more carefully manipulate, we effectively created our own newspaper reports, and we manipulated whether our participants read stories about anti-racists confronting white nationalists and whether or not they were violent or non-violent. And then we measured support for the causes of anti-racists, the causes of white nationalists, and so on. And what we found is that when the anti-racists used violence, this decreased public support for the anti-racists, but not only that, I think much more detrimentally, it increased support for the white nationalists. As a sociologist, I'm interested in some of the social mechanisms that can create a leg up for altruism. I define an altruist as someone who cares at least at a non-zero, at a significant level, about others' outcomes. We had access to data across a number of countries that was longitudinal. And this was very important because we can look to see whether if you're altruistic or more altruistic or more egoistic, say, in this particular year, how does this affect whether or how much of a pay raise you will experience over time? And what we found is that while more egoistic types may start out at higher salaries, altruists experience significantly larger raises over time. And this was robust to many controls that we threw at the model. So it wasn't that altruists were, say, living in different parts of the country, or that they were more or less likely to be married. We control for all of these things, and net of these things, altruists experienced larger raises over time. I'm a sociologist by accident only, but it's the best accident that has ever happened to me, I think. I was going to be a high school math teacher and just started reading a bit of sociology around the same time that it occurred to me that the last thing I should do is try to teach high school kids what they don't want to learn for the rest of my life. So I switched my major to sociology and thought that I would just become some sort of social worker. Finished my degree. A friend of mine gave me a job. I was terrible at that job. So it took me about a month or two to realize that I needed to go back to graduate school, and started the graduate program at the University of South Carolina under the mentorship of a incredible guy named David Willer. And he really, I think in many ways, is responsible for me becoming a professional sociologist. I think the best advice that I could and would give is that it is important to demand data and evidence for claims now more than ever, because there are so many just incredibly false claims across the political spectrum. There seems to be a massive deficit of data and evidence for claims, and this is, in some ways, this is paradoxical, because data and information is more available and cheaper than it's ever been. So I think that the most important thing that we can do as citizens is demand evidence from people when they make claims. I think humans are overly cynical about other humans. When we trust that others are more altruistic than we typically assume, we tend to beget altruism from that trust, right? So when we adjust our expectations to the fact that humans are surprisingly prosocial, that leads us to engage in more prosocial behavior, and that brings its own rewards tenfold.